The morning light drifted through the cracked blinds like a gentle apology, touching the edges of Emma's small kitchen as if trying not to disturb her. She stood beside the sink, her hands wrapped around a chipped mug, the steam rising in faint ribbons. Her daughter, Lily, was still asleep in the next room, curled beneath a fading quilt Emma's mother once made. The apartment was old, worn, and a little too quiet, yet it held the kind of fragile hope only single mothers truly understood. Emma breathed in slowly, letting the warmth of the mug settle her. She had learned to appreciate these quiet moments before the chaos of the day, the rush to get Lily ready for school, the buses that never arrived on time, and the long walk through the wealthier neighborhoods where she cleaned houses for people who never bothered to learn her name. She wasn't bitter about it, not really. Life had shaped her into something softer, not harder, but the softness came with its own kind of loneliness. Outside, the world was stirring awake. The city hummed in low tones, the distant rumble of delivery trucks, the sharp hiss of early traffic, the call of someone shouting down the block. Emma tucked a loose strand of hair behind her ear, grabbed her coat, and kissed Lily's forehead before slipping into the hallway. She walked with a quiet determination, her boots carrying her toward a life bigger than the one she'd been handed. Still, she felt the weight of everything: responsibility, exhaustion, dreams she rarely dared to name. There were days when hope felt like a distant shore she could see but never reach. Today, though, the air felt different. As Emma approached the Whitmore district, the wealthiest corner of the city, the atmosphere shifted. Mansions lined the street like silent declarations of power, their gardens perfectly manicured even in the cool morning breeze. She had cleaned most of these homes at one point or another. Some families were kind, others dismissive, but none of them had ever made her feel seen. She didn't expect anything different. Not here. The estate she was headed to today rose above the others, tall and commanding, with stone pillars and wide iron gates. It belonged to the Whitmore family. Old money, old influence, and old rules. Emma had heard countless rumors about them over the years, though she tried never to listen. People with power always carried stories like shadows. She pushed the gate open gently, careful not to let it clang. The driveway stretched long, lined with elm trees that whispered softly in the wind. Each step she took felt like entering another world, one built on expectations and secrets she could never touch. She paused to steady her breath. She didn't know it yet, but this was the day everything would begin to change. Inside the foyer, sunlight poured through tall windows, turning the marble floors into a quiet constellation of reflections. Emma placed her bag down and pulled out her cleaning supplies. Her movements were practiced, almost graceful, the kind of fluidity that came from necessity rather than choice. She had just begun dusting the stairway banister when she heard steps behind her. They were slow, deliberate, confident, but not loud, not arrogant. Something gentler. Emma turned, and for a breath she forgot what air was. A man stood at the edge of the hallway, a presence more than a figure at first. Broad-shouldered, dressed in a tailored charcoal suit, his tie slightly loosened as if he'd just returned from escaping expectations. His hair was dark, his jaw structured, and his eyes carried a softness she wasn't prepared for. A softness out of place in a home like this. He looked at her not with judgment, but with something like curiosity, like recognition, though they had never met. Their eyes held. Just for a moment. Time shifted. Everything grew still. Then he blinked, as though remembering who he was supposed to be. "I didn't mean to startle you," he said quietly, his voice deep but unguarded. Emma swallowed, gripping the cloth in her hand. "You didn't. I just didn't expect anyone to be home." A small, almost reluctant smile touched his lips. "I live here, at least for now." There was something in the way he said it, something tired beneath the polished exterior. Emma nodded politely and stepped aside, letting him pass though he hadn't moved. She didn't know his name yet, but the world around them seemed to shift as if making room for something it had been waiting for. He hesitated before turning away, his gaze lingering on her for a heartbeat longer than it should have. She felt it. He felt it. The quiet pull between two lives that were never meant to touch. As he disappeared down the corridor, Emma exhaled a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. And the thought arrived uninvited, impossible to ignore. Nothing about today would remain ordinary. a truth she would soon understand far more deeply than she was ready for. The following week moved with the sleepy pace of early autumn, as if the town itself wasn't ready to let go of summer. Mornings carried that soft, golden haze, the kind that blurs edges and makes everything feel a little unreal, a little suspended above the ordinary. Emma walked her usual route to the market, her canvas tote brushing against her hip, her breath visible in faint little wisps. She took comfort in routines, quiet ones, predictable ones, anything that didn't remind her how fragile stability really was. But ever since that afternoon at the Whitmore estate, those routines felt different, as if someone had gently loosened the threads tying her world in place. She kept seeing him in her memory, the way Liam Whitmore had looked at her, steady but not arrogant, curious but careful. Not pitying. Never that. And that alone unsettled her. People like him don't look at people like me that way, she told herself more than once. Yet the thought didn't settle anything. It stirred more than it soothed. A small wind curled through the street, tossing a few auburn leaves across her path. She paused to watch them roll along the pavement, then let out a breath she hadn't realized she'd been holding. Change was coming. She could feel it. She returned to the estate later that afternoon, only because Mrs. Whitmore had insisted on hosting a charity planning meeting and wanted the place spotless. Emma tried not to think about whether she might see him again. She tried even harder not to hope. The mansion was quieter than usual, its echoing hallways filled only with the distant hum of staff preparing trays of pastries. Emma moved room to room with practiced efficiency, but her mind was nowhere near her work. It drifted toward a pair of eyes that had held her a moment too long. When she stepped into the library, she froze. He was there. Liam sat near the window, sunlight catching in his hair like warm threads of copper. He wasn't reading, just staring out at the gardens with a furrowed expression, as if wrestling with thoughts he rarely voiced. He noticed her instantly. "Emma," he said, her name falling softly, as though he'd been thinking it already. She steadied her breath. "I didn't know anyone would be in here. I can come back." "No, please. Stay." His voice carried a quiet sincerity that made leaving impossible. She stepped inside, clutching a dust cloth that suddenly felt ridiculous between her fingers. There was a beat of silence, a thoughtful one, not uncomfortable. "You come here often," he said gently, "yet somehow you feel like the only honest thing in this house." She startled at the words, too intimate, too revealing, yet he didn't seem to realize the weight they held. Or maybe he did. "That's not true," she whispered, trying to steady herself. "I'm just here to work. Nothing more." His gaze didn't shift. People say that about themselves when they're used to being underestimated. Her pulse stuttered. The conversation might have ended there if not for the small sound from the doorway, Emma's daughter, Lily, peeking in with her backpack still half unzipped. "Mom, you forgot my snack." Emma quickly took the container from her own bag, cheeks warming as she handed it over. Lily waved shyly at Liam before dashing back down the hall. "That's your daughter?" he asked, his tone softening. "Yes. She's everything." Liam nodded almost reverently. "I can tell." Something shifted then, not exactly closeness, but an understanding. A bridge forming between two worlds that shouldn't touch. "She's lucky to have you," he added. Emma didn't know what to say to that. No one ever spoke to her like that. Without judgment, without assumptions, without that subtle tilt of superiority she'd grown accustomed to navigating around. Most people saw a young single mother and filled in the rest with stereotypes. He didn't, and that scared her more than disdain ever had. As the afternoon stretched into early evening, their paths crossed again in the hall by chance, or maybe by something quieter, something unnamed. He held the door as she passed. She thanked him. Their hands brushed. Not fully, not intentionally, just a ghost of contact. But it lingered. Later, she found him again, this time in the gallery corridor. He wasn't looking at the paintings. He was watching her reflection in the glass. "You work so hard," he said quietly. "Do you ever rest?" She smiled faintly. "Rest feels like a luxury, one I can't always afford." His expression changed, something like anger, but not at her. At the world, perhaps. At the systems that drew lines between people like her and people like him. "That isn't fair," he murmured. "It's life," she answered. But even as she said it, she sensed something dangerous forming between them, not reckless, Not inappropriate, just deeply human. Two lives orbiting closer than they should. Two worlds leaning toward each other. And for the first time, she felt the faint outline of a boundary she wasn't supposed to cross. A line drawn years before she ever stepped into this house. Yet here he was, standing on the other side of it, looking at her as if crossing it was the most natural thing in the world. At the end of the day, as she packed her supplies, Mrs. Whitmore's voice echoed from upstairs. Sharp, commanding, unmistakably impatient. Liam flinched almost imperceptibly. Emma noticed. And in that moment, a truth settled heavily between them. He wasn't as free as she thought. "Emma," he said softly, stopping her at the door. "Would you stay a moment?" The question hung between them. Dangerous, delicate, impossible. And everything in her froze. Here comes the part where everything changes, she thought. She wasn't wrong. Emma didn't stay. Not really. Not in the way he'd hoped. When Liam asked her to remain a moment longer, she felt every part of herself pull in opposite directions. One yearning forward, the other anchoring her to the reality she could never escape. She'd mumbled something about needing to pick up Lily, something about the late hour, something safe, something true enough to hide behind. But his eyes told her he'd wanted to say more, and that alone followed her home like a quiet shadow. The next morning was unusually crisp, the kind of cold that makes the skin tighten and the heart fold in on itself. Emma tried to shake the heaviness that lingered from the night before, convincing herself she had imagined the intensity in Liam's voice. He didn't mean anything by it, she told herself. But the thought didn't settle. It twisted. It lingered. By the time she arrived at the Whitmore estate again, she built a whole wall around her chest. A thin one, maybe, but enough to keep her breathing steady. Or so she thought. She hadn't been in the house 5 minutes before she heard voices, raised, sharp, unmistakably strained. It wasn't anger exactly, but something far more cutting. Mrs. Whitmore and Liam. Their words blurred together, muffled by the thick walls, but Emma caught pieces. Responsibility to this family. Not the life I want. Appearances, Liam, appearances. Tired of pretending. Then silence. A heavy, trembling silence. Emma froze in the hallway, unsure whether to move or disappear entirely. Before she could decide, the library door opened and Liam stepped out, jaw tight, breathing uneven. He saw her instantly. Something inside him faltered. "Emma." She shook her head gently. "I didn't hear anything." His voice cracked on the edges of exhaustion. "You don't have to pretend." But she did. Pretending was how she survived. Still, she held his eyes a second too long. And something in that moment, fragile, trembling, felt like the beginning of a dangerous truth. The day unfolded quietly after that, though quiet didn't suit the air in the mansion anymore. It felt thick, charged, almost brittle. Emma kept to her tasks, trying not to replay the glimpses of tension she'd witnessed. By mid-afternoon, she stepped onto the terrace to shake out a cloth, grateful for the fresh air. Liam was there too, leaning against the stone railing, staring out at the gardens with a far-away look she couldn't read. He didn't turn when he spoke. "Do you ever feel like you're living a life someone else chose for you?" Emma hesitated. "Every day." That made him look at her. Really look. "You deserve more than this," he said softly. "To deserve something doesn't mean you get it." He exhaled, a sound full of frustration and sadness, and something else she didn't dare name. He took a step closer, then another, and just before he reached her, the terrace door slammed open. "Liam." Mrs. Whitmore's tone was ice wrapped in velvet. She didn't look at Emma. She looked through her, the way people look through fog on a window, annoyed it's even there. "Your presence is required downstairs," she told her son. "And you." She finally addressed Emma with a thin, brittle smile. "I'll need your help in the dining room shortly." The message beneath the politeness was unmistakable. Know your place. But the real blow came later. Emma had just finished wiping down a long table when Mrs. Whitmore casually approached her, as if making small talk. "You've been here quite often lately, haven't you?" the older woman asked. "Yes, ma'am. With the charity event." "Oh, of course." Mrs. Whitmore waved a hand delicately. "I simply hope you understand how delicate it can be when staff become too familiar with the family. People talk. And my son has been under considerable pressure lately. Emma stiffened. I don't want any trouble. I'm just here to work. I'm relieved to hear that. Her smile sharpened. Because young women in your position often confuse kindness for interest. And that never ends well. The words hit like cold water. More than cold, freezing. And in that moment, Emma realized the truth. Mrs. Whitmore hadn't spoken in anger. She'd spoken in warning. When Emma stepped outside to clear her mind, she found Liam waiting near the gate, hands tucked into his coat pockets, eyes dark with worry. What did she say to you? Nothing. Emma lied. Liam didn't believe it. She could see that in the way his jaw tightened. Emma, I need you to trust me. Trust. A fragile word. A dangerous one. I can't, she whispered. His breath caught. Why not? Because your world isn't mine. And people in your world make sure it stays that way. The hurt in his expression was unmistakable. And that made her chest ache. He reached for her hand, but she pulled it back instinctively, as if holding him might crumble everything she was trying so hard to protect. Emma! Her name broke on his tongue. She stepped away before he could finish. I can't give Lily a life full of shadows, she said softly. And whatever this is, it lives in the dark. For a long moment, neither of them breathed. Then, because the world can be cruel in quiet ways, Mrs. Whitmore's voice called his name sharply from the doorway. Emma took a step back. Then another. And Liam understood. She was leaving. Not just the estate, but him. That night, as she walked home beneath the dim glow of street lamps, the truth pressed into her heart like a bruise. Something had begun between them, and now it was breaking. The following days unfolded like a long, muted ache, one of those aches the body learns to carry even when the heart hasn't figured out how. Emma stayed away from the Whitmore estate, not because she wanted to, but because every instinct whispered that distance was the safest choice. For Lily, for herself, for the fragile line she feared she'd already crossed. But distance doesn't silence what the heart remembers. And Liam remembered everything. On the fourth day, a soft knock fell against Emma's door, so gentle it might have been the wind if her heart hadn't recognized who it belonged to. When she opened it, Liam stood there, unshaven, exhausted, and somehow even more undone than the last time she saw him. Emma, he breathed. She swallowed hard. You shouldn't be here. I know. His voice cracked. But I couldn't stay there. For a moment, neither moved. Then he stepped inside, closing the door behind him with a care that made the room feel smaller, warmer, more dangerous. Emma's hands trembled. Liam, this isn't. She told you something, didn't she? His eyes were sharp, searching. My mother. What did she say? Emma looked away. Does it matter? It does, he whispered. Because I know her. And whatever she said, it wasn't the truth. Those words stilled her breath. Because if he was right, then hiding wasn't protection. It was surrender. Liam, she said softly, please don't make this harder. He shook his head. You deserve to know why she reacted that way. Emma braced herself. He dragged a hand through his hair, pacing once, twice, before finally letting the truth fall. She's not protecting me, he said quietly. She's protecting herself, her reputation, her carefully curated world. His voice grew rough. But mostly, she's afraid I'll repeat my father's mistakes. Emma blinked. Your father. Liam exhaled a long, shuddering breath. He was in love with someone else once. Before my mother. Someone from a different world. And when the family found out, they didn't just interfere, they destroyed everything. They cut her out of his life, pressured him into a marriage he didn't want yet, and my mother has never forgotten it. A sharp silence sliced between them. That's why she's afraid, Liam continued. Not because of you, but because I'm becoming the man he once was, the man he wished he had been brave enough to stay. Emma's heart clenched, not from fear, but from the painful weight of understanding. You should hate her for that, she whispered. I don't. His eyes softened. But I won't let her fear dictate my life. A fragile hope flickered inside her, so small she was afraid to breathe wrong and extinguish it. But hope, even fragile, is still hope. They sat down on the edge of her worn couch, not touching, the space between them humming with all the words they hadn't yet said. I was scared, Emma admitted. The confession tasted like truth and regret intertwined. Not of you. Not really. I was scared of what loving someone like you would cost Lily. And what it would cost me to lose you later. Liam's voice softened into something almost broken. You think I'd leave? You think you wouldn't? Her question trembled. You live in a world built on expectations. Mine is built on survival. People like me don't get to gamble with people like you. He leaned forward, elbows on his knees, hands clasped so tightly they shook. But what if it isn't a gamble? He whispered. What if it's the first thing in my life that finally feels like a choice? Emma stared at him, her chest rising with a breath she didn't realize she'd been holding. Liam! He turned to her, eyes unguarded. I care about you. More than I've allowed myself to understand. And I care about Lily too. I'm not confused about that. For the first time, she let herself meet his gaze without fear. And what she saw there, the sincerity, the longing, the quiet ache, made her heart collapse inward. A single tear slid down her cheek. Liam reached out slowly, giving her time to pull away. She didn't. His fingers brushed her cheek with a tenderness that felt like forgiveness, like possibility, like something she had tried so hard not to need. Emma, he murmured, I'm not asking for promises. I'm asking for a chance. Just a chance to show you that what's happening between us, it isn't something to run from. Her voice was barely a breath. And if your family stands in the way? His answer was immediate. Then I'll stand anyway. A quiet, trembling silence wrapped around them. It wasn't a declaration. It wasn't a vow. But it was something stronger. Finally, Emma whispered the words she'd been afraid to say. I don't want to run anymore. Liam closed his eyes, relief flooding his face like light breaking through storm clouds. She reached for his hand. This time, she didn't pull away. Their fingers intertwined. A beginning. Soft. Tentative. Fragile. But real. Through the window, the night lay still, quiet, waiting. The world outside hadn't changed. But something inside them had. And as Emma rested her forehead gently against his, she felt the faint spark of a truth she had buried too deep. Love isn't always safe. But sometimes, it's worth every risk. Morning arrived slowly, as if unsure whether it was welcome. Emma stood at the small kitchen counter, watching the first strands of light stretch across the floor. Lily was still asleep. The apartment was quiet. Too quiet, in the way that happens when something inside you has shifted so deeply that even silence hears it. Liam had left only an hour earlier, after a night spent talking in fragments. Soft truths, hesitant hopes, fears neither of them fully knew how to name. Nothing dramatic, nothing reckless, just honesty. The kind of honesty that changes the air you breathe. And yet, the world outside hadn't changed. Love isn't always safe, but sometimes it's worth every risk. The words pulsed through her, the leitmotif that had followed her through every moment of uncertainty. Emma closed her eyes and exhaled. Today, they would need more than whispered promises. They would need courage. Across town in the Whitmore estate, another morning unfolded. This one sharp, cold, deliberate. Margaret Whitmore sat at the long dining table, her posture like carved marble, her expression unreadable. For a moment, Liam considered leaving things as they were, letting silence smooth the edges, pretending life could go back to something familiar. But then he pictured Emma, her tired eyes, her strength, her fear, and he knew returning to silence was a choice he would never forgive himself for. So he walked into the dining room and spoke the truth aloud. Mother, I need to tell you something. She didn't look up from her tea. I assume this is about the girl. He resisted the urge to wince. Her name is Emma. And you're still involved with her, she said, though it wasn't a question. Despite everything I made clear. Liam sat across from her, hand steady. Because everything you made clear was based on your past, not mine. For the first time, she lifted her gaze and he saw it. The flicker of fear she had disguised as disapproval. My father, he continued, made choices he never recovered from. But the mistake wasn't loving someone he shouldn't have. The mistake was letting others decide whether he was allowed to. Margaret stared and softened. But it didn't harden either. You think you're stronger than he was? She asked quietly. No, Liam said. But I think love looks different now. And I think I'm allowed to choose what kind of man I want to be. The room held its breath. After a long moment, Margaret set her teacup down with a sound so soft it felt like surrender. I only ever wanted to protect you, she murmured. I know, Liam whispered. But protection can become a cage if you don't open the door. Margaret closed her eyes, and when she opened them again, something in her had shifted, barely, but undeniably. Then go, she said, and be sure. Liam rose. I already am. Emma wasn't expecting him. She wasn't expecting anything, really. She had taught herself not to. So when he knocked lightly, her heart jumped, but her hope stayed still. When she opened the door and saw him standing there, she knew. Something had changed. Liam stepped inside and exhaled as if he'd been carrying the weight of a decade rather than a single morning. It's done, he said softly. Emma felt her breath catch. What do you mean? I told her everything. I told her about you. About how I feel. About Lily. I told her I wasn't walking away. Emma stared at him, the truth slow to settle. And she didn't stop you, she whispered. She tried, he admitted. But not in the way you think. She tried because she's afraid of repeating the past. But then she realized, I'm not my father. And this time, the story doesn't have to end in silence. Emma felt something inside her break, quietly, like a thread snapping under too much strain. But what replaced it wasn't fear. It was relief. Warm. Steady. Real. Liam, she whispered, I don't know how to fit into your world. You don't have to, he said, taking her hand. We'll make a new one. One that belongs to us. A tear slipped down her cheek. He brushed it away with the back of his hand, gently, reverently, like someone touching a truth they'd spent too long searching for. Lily stirred in the hallway, rubbing her eyes, confused by the early morning voices. When she saw Liam, she blinked once, then smiled. You came back. Liam knelt. I meant what I said. I care about you. I'm not going anywhere. Emma watched them, her heart full in a way she hadn't allowed in years. A family. Not yet. Not fully. But the shape of one. Later, as the sun climbed higher, Emma stepped outside with Liam. The winter air was crisp, carrying the faint smell of wood smoke in morning. She looked at him, really looked at him, and felt that inevitable tug, the one she had tried so hard to resist. Are we doing the right thing? She asked quietly. Liam wrapped his fingers around hers. Maybe the right thing, he murmured, is simply the thing that sets us free. Emma closed her eyes, and for the first time, freedom didn't feel like something distant. It felt like breath, like light, like choosing love even when the world said she shouldn't. Love isn't always safe, but sometimes it's worth every risk. Those words settled in the air, soft, certain, final. Emma opened her eyes, and with a trembling, hopeful smile, she whispered the last truth their story needed. Then let's be brave. The wind carried her words away, but the meaning stayed. And their story, born in shadows, shaped by fear, held together by courage, finally stepped into the light. Because some loves aren't meant to be hidden. They're meant to be lived, one fearless breath at a time.